Okay. Great to be here, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you, Alan. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've already heard a little bit of your background, Alan. There's probably some people here who don't know who I am. My name is Jason Dean, as I say, as he said, completely forgotten his name now. It's getting bad. I'm here today because really I've been in the space now for about 6 years full time. Now I discovered Bitcoin actually earlier than that. It was about 2013. And to be honest, I did what a lot of people do, a lot of us do when we first start the Bitcoin journey. We discover it, we don't really understand it, and... Louder? Okay, let's move this up a little bit, shall we? How about that? Please bear with me. I'll hold it here. Try that. That's okay, right? Okay, so I've been in the space full time for about 6 years, and again, I didn't understand it initially. So eventually I got involved fully, and these days I'm the Bitcoin analyst at Matthew Greenspan's operation, Quantum Economics. I've also written a book myself called How to Explain Bitcoin to Your Mum, which came about because I tried to explain Bitcoin to my mum, and it didn't work terribly well. So I wrote that book, and that started me on this path. But over the last 6 years, obviously I've read a lot of other books as well, and including this particular one, which I'm holding in my hand now, which is written by this gentleman here. And if you haven't got this book yet, by the way, Bitcoin is Venice, I do recommend that you grab it and have a look at it. It is a fabulous, fabulous book, and this is the author with me now. So we've already got a bit of your professional background, obviously, but we are now going to be talking about this book. And I've got to say, the first time I read it, there were certain chapters that really stuck in my mind. And in actual fact, we're going to be talking more or less around one of those chapters today. And that's what the name of this session has come from. This is not capitalism. Now, I'm not going to give anything else away at this stage, because if you think you've had your minds blown so far, there's another angle here that we haven't even really covered yet. So I think the best way to do it is if I just ask you a question, because I did actually come prepared with a few questions for you, right? So I'm going to spring these on you a little bit. So let's look at the UK right now, okay? So we've got some really interesting developments economically going on now, politically as well. When I flew up here yesterday, when we took off, we had a prime minister. When I landed, we didn't have a prime minister, which was probably expected in many ways. But given everything that's going on right now, is this proof in your mind that capitalism itself isn't working right now?
So, well, first of all, can you hear me? Good. Short answer is no. It is absolutely not proof of that. I guess the very long answer is the chapter in the book, so I'll try to aim for something in between. If the state was solely responsible for let's say the potato industry, right? Only the state is allowed to grow and sell potatoes. Nobody else can. Anyone else who ever did either goes to jail or has all their potato growing capital reallocated to the state instead. If that were the case, I'm pretty confident that we would describe the potato industry as nationalized. We would describe any policy that recommends that or recommended it prior to it happening probably as socialist. And when the price of potatoes goes up and the quality goes down, everyone would be clear as to why. Or at least if they maybe disagreed for political reasons, we would at least be able to have a sensible conversation about why. Now, my incredibly hot take is that money is more important than potatoes, right? And yet, people who, I think the vast majority of people who aren't in this room, to be clear, who call themselves capitalists or who, in whatever form it takes, claim to like the idea of capitalism, claim to be in favor of it, seem to have no problem with the state having a monopoly on money. And in many cases, not only are they kind of indifferent, but they will actively take the other side of this argument. They'll play the role of the potato socialist in arguing why this has to be the case, and all hell will break loose if there's a free market and money. But I think it's even worse than this, in part because, as I said, money's more important than potatoes. It's not just that the potato trade, I guess, is a very small proportion of every trade, whereas money is half of every trade. It's more important, I think, in a different way also, which is that money is not itself wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. And so I'm sure some of you will have heard this before, but Seyfedin Amous likes to say that just because you sell more tickets to a stadium doesn't mean there are any more seats, right? And we're not yet at the point, it often feels like we're very, very close to the point, but we're not yet at the point where people are showing up to the stadium and realizing that they bought something that's worthless, that they will never get repaid. That's the bust. That's what we will eventually inevitably get to. We're at a point where the real effects of this, I think, are even more insidious because it affects people's behavior. So if you think you are going to the stadium, if you think you have a ticket that will get you a seat, up until that point, you will behave differently than if you hadn't. And so in the wider realm of money rather than just potatoes or just stadium tickets, you will act effectively as if you think you can consume more than has actually been produced. That is why inevitably you will end up with this bust. And so I think the other problem actually that follows from all of this, and is a nice way of wrapping up this point, is that I guess another difference, fairly obvious difference, is that if we nationalize potatoes and potatoes become horrible and expensive and so on and so forth, you have a choice, right? You can eat something else. You can eat carrots if you want. You can't just choose not to use money. You are forced to use state money currently if you want to participate in any kind of economic activity whatsoever. And I think the most important kind of economic activity you can engage in is the creation of capital. So exactly the means of production that the potato socialists might want to nationalize, but in fact applies to absolutely everything. So I would argue that no, we absolutely do not have capitalism, because the most important price, for which we praise the free market somewhat in the abstract for giving us accurate prices, the most important price, the price of money, is permanently wrong. So no. Back to the short answer, no, we don't.
So is it that our definition... It's a fabulous answer, by the way. Is it that our definition of capitalism itself is flawed? I mean, that seems to be what you're implying there.
I said this in the panel before, so people will probably find this kind of amusing. It depends what you mean, right? So I would reject that our definition of capitalism is wrong. I think that, at least politically, my impression, to be very crude about a political split, if you just want to call it left and right, which I don't really subscribe to, but for the purpose of this argument, the right defends what we have because they claim to like capitalism, and the left attacks what we have because they claim to dislike capitalism, but both are wrong because this is not capitalism. And both have entirely valid points, I think, which actually gets to why I don't really like that breakdown in the first place. I think, again, very, very crudely, the left is right about the harms of what we currently have. They just don't know how to solve it, really, because they don't know what the real problem is. And the right is correct about completely in abstract the benefits of capitalism, but they don't know what they're talking about because, again, we don't have capitalism. So somewhat annoyingly, it comes down as kind of a definitional thing. You have to clear up the language before you can have a sensible conversation about this. Hence the title, right? Hence, this is not capitalism.
Exactly.
That's exactly the argument that we make in the book.
So we're talking obviously about what is happening now. I mean, has it ever been a stage by your definition that capitalism has worked in the past? I mean, are things fundamentally very different now to what they were in the past?
Yes, with a couple of caveats. So this is something that I think Bitcoiners are unfortunately susceptible to in terms of kind of getting a little bit too excited about this. I don't think that either a free market for money or what you would expect to emerge from that, just sound money. You know, you could have state-run sound money. It's incredibly unlikely. It has never lasted, but in theory, you could have it. I don't think that is sufficient for what I would call capitalism. I think it's certainly necessary, and hence, because we don't have it now, we don't have capitalism. But you need quite a lot else as well. To focus on just a few things, I don't have an entirely exhaustive list of this, but you certainly need property rights, and you arguably need a culture that respects the idea of accumulating capital in the first place. And I don't think that really needs to be very explicit. I don't think people need to be able to recite to you what that means necessarily and, you know, give you an economic sermon just on the street. But I think it can be encapsulated really more ethically than in economic terms. It follows naturally from people being respectful of others, engaging voluntarily as much as is possible, in as many areas as is possible, and being responsible for themselves. And I think a lot of this does helpfully come back to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin enforces these characteristics in many ways, right? You can only get somebody's $5 rent tax aside, right? You can only get somebody's Bitcoin because you convince them to give it to you. If you don't take responsibility for it, you're in trouble, not your keys, not your coins, etc. So I think Bitcoin certainly paves the way to something that I'd be more comfortable to call capitalism, but just a note of caution that it's not sufficient on its own.
Okay, but if we talk about where we are now with our economy, let's leave Bitcoin aside for the moment.
What?
No. I know. I know. Just for a second, just go with me. I mean, isn't there an argument to say we should be using the existing tools that we have to try and grow our way out of this situation? Is that even possible? Could we do that?
Yeah. No. So short answer, no. Long answer in the book. I'll go for a medium answer now. I think this again is a really insidious confusion of language. So you can correct me if I'm mistaken, but what I think you mean by grow our way out of it is grow, I'll explain in a second why I'm doing that, but grow GDP. So it's back to, if you remember, Greg Foss, not even when he was on stage, but in Pierre's video, there's that famous clip of him. I'm sure he said this loads of times, but that clip is very dramatic, where he's saying, you know, the fiat has to be the difference between the numerator and the denominator, right? And the numerator of global debt is just completely out of control, and there's no way that GDP can catch up with it. And actually, I should win the prize for being the most toxic, because I'm going to shit on Greg now. I don't think anyone else has the courage to do that. I need to swear jar again. But so I think that view that Greg outlines of debt running away from GDP's ability to capture it isn't bearish enough, right? It's worse even than that, and I'll tell you why. What it comes down to in my mind is that GDP is not a good metric. I don't want to say it's completely useless, because it makes sense. It's just almost always misused. So this is why I was saying grow before, or putting it in, you know, inverted commas before, because what people mean when they talk about growing GDP, strictly speaking, isn't a growth rate at all. It's an increase. So to put this in a slightly wider context as well, what GDP actually means is effectively aggregate revenue. It's the amount of earnings that everybody has made before any of their costs, right? So it's crucially not profit. It's just sales, effectively. But it's for everybody, for an entire country. Even profit is a better metric because clearly it tells you if you're doing something valuable. You can have the biggest GDP you want and everyone could still be losing money because you're just destroying things, right? You're not actually adding any value.
Which is arguably happening
Yes,
now.
This is where I'm going. That this is, I think, is what's happening now. So profit is better, but even profit isn't perfect. What you actually want both to evaluate the economic health, if you like, of a country or whatever, of any entity, is its returns. So what that means is the profit divided by basically the real answer is a bit more technical than this, but the base of capital from which you're investing in the first place. That is a growth rate, right? GDP going up is not a growth rate. GDP going up is an increase. It may be a good thing, but it may not be a good thing. It's also I should have mentioned this earlier, but a kind of pet peeve of mine in the way people talk about GDP is that they seem to imply that it is a kind of a quantitative measure, or almost an equivalent in some sense, of economic health, right? Even aside from the misuse of the word growth, just GDP is good. Even if you got them to say it going up, right, it increasing, not growing, that's still a good thing. And that's just not necessarily true at all. So to get back to Greg's point and prove I am the most toxic Bitcoiner in the room, a very easy way to get sales effectively to go up, to get revenue to go up, and hence to get GDP to go up, is to take on more debt. And so even the idea that GDP can grow, can increase, and that will help with debt is comical if your base of capital is not healthy in the first place. If you're not, and this is back to what is capitalism, right? If you don't have a culture of nurturing and growing the actual means by which we are wealthy, like what allows us to create goods and services and to drive down their prices, to a lot of what Jeff Booth was talking about earlier. If all you care about is sales, you can achieve that very easily by levering up. And finally to get back to the question, having thoroughly debunked Greg Foss, the reason he's not bearish enough is that the way that we will try to close that gap, he's right that we'll still fail. Fiat will still be the difference between the numerator and the denominator. But the way that we're going to try is going to be to lever up more. And none of it will work. It's all going to zero.
I mean, that really does kind of change your perception on how we're viewing these numbers. I mean, because most of us go straight to the GDP number, right?
Yeah.
We look at it and go, well, that must be a proper real number because the government. Actually, I'm listening to myself saying this, and I'm saying, what am I? I'm not even going to finish that sentence, right? So,
but you're talking about what regular people think, so I think it's fair.
Yeah, okay,
you don't think this.
Thanks for the save there.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's. I mean, we can talk about this for a long time, but let's just try and bring a context of Bitcoin into it, because it does raise an interesting question, because I know I don't look it, but I'm a year older than our entire fiat-based money system.
Right? So you're going to say me?
No, that's me, all right? So, because that, it's incredible to think that system is only 51 years old.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what we all use is only 51 years old, and that's just a blink of an eye in kind of human existence. Now, my daughter is a year older than Bitcoin, right? So if you were going to ask one of us for financial advice, I'm hoping you come to me rather than my daughter, because I've got some worldly knowledge and I've been around a bit. So, just sort of playing devil's advocate slightly, really. I mean, how can we look at something like Bitcoin and say, look, this 13-year-old thing is better than this 50-year-old system that we're running now and the system that came before that?
Well, I actually think you hit the nail on the head in the way you framed the question, because I don't think most people are aware of this. I think that it's perfectly sensible to regard fiat, I suppose I'll call since 1971 fiat, although I'm sure you can argue about definitions, but the current monetary regime, right? It's perfectly sensible to regard it as an experiment, as a very short-term thing in the broader scheme of capital accumulation, say, right? Capitalism, civilization even. It's an experiment that I think is, obviously I think this, increasingly more and more people are thinking this is an experiment that's failing. So I actually think that there's maybe two different ways of approaching this question. The part that focuses on fiat rather than that focuses on Bitcoin, which I'll get to in a second, is just making people aware of this, because I really don't think that most people know. And I joke about this quite a lot, that I'm not even really so much pro-Bitcoin as I am anti-fiat, right? I'm like quite pro-Bitcoin, but I'm even more anti-fiat. I think fiat is a worse negative than Bitcoin is a positive. But the reason I say I joke about it is that most people, Bitcoiners, again, obviously get it. Most regular people have no idea what that means. And that is part of the problem. It's so much easier to understand Bitcoin, even if you don't even approach any of the technical details. You just basically believe various kind of high-level things about how it works. It's so much easier to appreciate why that's valuable, even if you don't understand it yet, if you understand what it is opposed to. And crucially, I think this is actually this is like, what would you call it, mimetically important. You appreciate how new it is, right? Because it makes Bitcoin seem less new. But then I should say something positive about Bitcoin as well, that of these two very new things, in the broader scheme of capitalism, civilization, etc., Bitcoin has significantly, I won't talk about this for too long, I know everybody knows this, but it has significantly better properties. I think not just as money, like everyone knows all of that off by heart by now. Greg and Larry talked about it for a good 20, 30 minutes earlier anyway. But in terms of how you ought to approach it and understand it in the first place. So apologies for repeating myself a little bit. I said something similar on the panel I was on before, but fiat, as well as being an experiment, is incredibly opaque, right? So there's this kind of this meme, I guess, of, regular people having no hope of understanding Bitcoin because it's too complicated. But then you ask them, okay, well, how does fiat work? And they're like, they actually have no idea. And then the people who do have an idea of both will tell you that, well, Bitcoin's actually much, much simpler. So it's not just that it's simpler, but in addition to that, it's verifiable, right? This is where don't trust, verify comes from in the first place. You have no choice but to trust how fiat works because you have no say and you can't even tell what they're doing, really, even if you did have a say. Whereas Bitcoin is exactly the opposite. If you run a node, you have exactly as much say as anybody else, which you all should, by the way. And you can, in fact, see exactly what's happening. You can assess it, I guess, from your own intelligence, right? You can approach it and understand it as fully as you would like to in a way that you just have no hope with fiat at all.
Yeah, in actual fact, I think I always think of fiat as a kind of an emotive backing, if you like. So it's got a belief system around it. We believe it has value, so we use it. It's got trust behind it. We trust our government. Right, I'm smiling again. Still can't do it. And of course, there's the men with guns argument as well. It's back. Yeah. There's a fear element, so you've got belief, trust and fear. Whereas Bitcoin is this series of absolutes. And we know what they are, those absolutes, and we can see them. So we've got the laws of thermodynamics, if you want to get into that, behind it. And of course, it's based on mathematics, which is absolutely precise. So with all of this that we know, with everything that's going on right now, and as we know, it's going to get very, very messy in the next few years. I don't think there's any way around that now. As far as I can work out, there's no positive outcome from here in terms of our existing system, our existing tools. So let's just bring it back to Bitcoin then. What hope can that give us? We've probably got some of the answers to that here, but what's your take? I'm really interested to hear what your take is, given the amount of work and research and understanding you have of our existing system. So where does that hope fit in?
So I think before I describe why I am hopeful, it is important to just not at all be misunderstood, not risk any misunderstanding that I completely share this fear. Things are going to get bad. We were talking backstage just before we came on that you flew up because of the prospect of a train strike, which otherwise you would have taken, probably would have been more enjoyable, and that probably most people don't really know or haven't really put the pieces together on this, that the reason train strikes are happening is ultimately because of inflation, right? It's a fiat problem, and actually, my mum, who kind of gets Bitcoin, by the way, so I'm not sure I need to give her your book. I might anyway, but she said to me the other day, I made fun of her for saying this immediately afterwards, but it then dawned on me how wise it actually was, that basically everything's breaking. Like, everything is going to start to break. This is just one example of it. So, yeah, I want it firmly on the record that I'm not, utopian about this, right? There's reason to be hopeful, but that hope is worthwhile in the first place because of how bad things are going to get. Okay, but with all the kind of doomerism out the way, something that I think is possibly an underrated characteristic of Bitcoin is very well understood, but I haven't really heard it communicated, especially externally, all that often, is that completely unlike any, let's say, political solution to these rolling crises, right? You can opt into Bitcoin entirely as an individual. You don't need to convince anybody else to join it or to do it for you. You don't need to start a political party. You don't need to lobby the Bank of England. And I could go on and on, but I don't think there's ever really been anything like this, at least in this realm, right? Bitcoin, I think, it follows on from, you can maybe even say it is an integral part of a lot of cultural movements that are predicated on the internet in terms of, offering truly decentralized alternatives to mainstream, whatever, institutions, narratives, etc. But obviously, as we all know, very much preaching to the choir here, it's the first one to build a notion of value into this. And obviously, back to my first answer about what happens when you mess with the price of money, the problems that we're facing, the rolling crises that I'm predicting that everybody's bracing for very much are rooted in an inability to value things properly and the consequences of forcing everybody to value things improperly. And so as a kind of a lifeline, I mean, there's all sorts of memes about this, it's like, it's not a bubble, it's the pin, it's not, it's the life raft off the Titanic and so on and so forth. But I really think that difference ought to be emphasized, that you can join it, so to speak, entirely on your own. And it's back to some of the ethical points I made earlier, which I think is a crucial connection to how it's inherently capitalistic, right? That you can take responsibility for yourself. You don't need to trust anybody else. You can do the verification and you can make your own decision.
Yeah, fabulous. And, I really appreciate, I've just kind of sprung those questions on you a bit there, and I was trying to play devil's advocate a little bit, so I appreciate your answers there. One thing I just would ask you, we know we've got some people who are new to Bitcoin here today. What would you say is the best sort of advice for them? Because they've heard a lot of conversations about the economic situation they probably didn't know. Most people who do understand now, at least fundamentally, what's going on with our money. That may have started some thought processes going there. I mean, what would you say is the best advice that you would give to people starting today or here for the first time learning? And by the way, to you guys, well done for being here, because even being here gives you a real advantage and a start in this process. But what would be your advice, would you say?
I think it follows on very nicely from my previous answer, that responsibility is absolutely paramount. There's no rush, is maybe one good way to put it. This isn't, it's not a JPEG, right? It's not a shitcoin. It's not a meme stock. You're not about to miss out on it going to the moon. You should take as much responsibility for understanding it as you can. So I've started saying this basically whenever I have the opportunity, again, just to avoid being misunderstood, that I never ever tell people to buy Bitcoin. And I'm not telling any of you to buy Bitcoin either. I will tell people that this is something that they absolutely should understand. And my prediction would be that if you do understand it sufficiently, the more you understand it, let's say, it's not a binary thing, the more you probably will want to buy it. But just be wary of that pressure. I think if you are starting to feel FOMO, basically, if it's coming across too lightly and the gravity of the situation is not in the back of your mind is not a core part of why you're interested in it in the first place, you maybe need to take a deep breath, make sure you do actually understand what's happening. I mean, aside from anything else, because it's completely plausible that if you have a insufficiently long-term view, if your idea of what wealth you're storing in Bitcoin is, if you experience this by checking the price every day, then by that metric, I guess, it's completely plausible you'll lose 90% of your wealth over some period, which I would argue is far, far too short. Because if you did understand it, you wouldn't have that time frame in mind in the first place. So take responsibility, make sure you understand what you're doing before you do anything.
Well, I think that's absolutely fabulous advice. I feel like I could sit and talk to you all day, but actually we have run out of time. We're going to start getting daggers in a minute if we don't get off the stage. But go and get the book. Bitcoin is Venice. Absolutely superb read. Alan, thank you so much for your time and indulging my questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That was great.